Now that we've talked about some radio networks and the programming that was on those networks, we need to talk about rules and legislation laws that were being developed for this new medium out there called radio. Early radio legislation was geared for doing a couple of things, mainly getting some order in all of this. The biggest problem was that all kinds of amateur radio was out there, as well as professional radio stations were being developed, and they were just kind of conflicting with each other. So the primary purpose of legislation was to bring some order to all of this chaos. The first radio legislation to come through the U.S. government was the Radio Act of 1912. And this was primarily a response to the Titanic disaster of April of 1912. And there were three main rules adopted. First was that ships at sea were required to have their wireless radios on 24 hours a day. They had to be manned, and they had to be available to capture, to receive any sort of emergency requests by ships at sea. There's an old sea axiom that whenever you're on the sea, you have a responsibility to help someone who is in distress on the sea. And if you remember with the Titanic, one of the tragedies of the Titanic disaster was that there was a ship that was 10 miles away from the Titanic that could have come and saved hundreds of lives, but the ship's operator, radio operator, had signed off for the day. And so the radio was turned off, and there was no way for them to know that there was actually a disaster going on just 10 miles from them and the lives that were being lost. So the first rule that was adopted in the Radio Act of 1912 was that all ships who were at sea were required to have their wireless radios manned 24 hours a day in case of some sort of emergency that they could respond to. The second was that from now on, anyone who wanted to own and operate a transmitter had to have a license. Again, up to this point, anyone could buy a transmitter, anyone could build a transmitter, anyone could send out signals so that anybody else could capture them. The Radio Act of 1912, this part of it was developed simply to try and put some order to this. From now on, if you wanted to run a transmitter or radio transmitter, you basically had to register with the U.S. government, which is related to the third part of the Radio Act, in that government now would establish that it is in control of anything related to broadcasting. It starts here with the Radio Act of 1912, and with respect to radio and radio telegraphy, but it would expand into television when television starts becoming more and more prominent around the country. Following the Radio Act of 1912 is the Act of 1927. And what's happening here is, again, building on the 1912 Act. And again, it's really, the purpose is to bring some order to all the chaos that is in the airwaves up to this point. So in order to really kind of get an understanding of what was going on, we have to see how radio actually works. Radio signals are in the form of waves. Basically, one wave or one cycle, or it's also known as a hertz, named after Heinrich Hertz, who came up with who discovered being able to send electrical signals through the air. It starts at the middle, goes up to the highest point, down back through the middle and to its lowest point, and then back up to the middle again. That is considered one complete wave. How many of these waves you have in a signal is called the frequency. Frequency is also used to determine characteristics of sound, how high-pitched a sound is or how low-pitched a sound is. But as far as signals are concerned, frequency is how many cycles there are per second. And it's frequency that determines where a radio station will be placed in the electromagnetic spectrum. So let's look at this electromagnetic spectrum. It goes from radio waves to gamma waves, and this is the low frequency versus high frequency. This is a finite space. There are 5 different types of wave spectrums, starting with radio and infrared. Radio and infrared we can't see. If you've ever had an infrared light, it's usually kind of purplish, yellow, or reddish, and it can show you things that stains or that kind of things that that are sensitive to infrared light. Radio waves, we're bombarded by radio waves all the time, but they aren't dangerous to us because they're a very low frequency. And consequently, we just kind of live through radio waves. In the middle is the visible spectrum, and these are light waves. This is what helps us to see things. You're actually not seeing an object with light on it. You're actually seeing the light being reflected off that object, and your eyes then make sense of it, that this object is of what the object is, because those light waves are bouncing off of it and then into your eyes, and then sending electronic impulses to your brain, defining what that object might be. X-rays, I'm sure we have all had some experience with X-rays. As we go through the spectrum here, you'll see that the high frequency or the frequency moves from low frequency to high frequency. And then the higher the frequency, the more intense those waves are. And the more intense those waves are, the higher the potential for damage to human tissue. X-rays are used to go through human tissue to give us pictures of our bones, and if we've broken an ankle or broken a leg or a finger or something like that, the bones are dense enough to actually show up or to stop the X-rays, and then we get this picture of the your skeleton or other things that X-rays can penetrate through, but then things that they can't, and then that gives us these X-ray images. We as humans can stand a certain amount of X-rays, but too many X-rays can actually do damage to tissue. Gamma rays are the highest frequency that we have, and gamma rays are definitely problematic for human tissue. Exposure to gamma rays can really destroy tissue very, very quickly, either on the exoskeleton or internally with our organs. So gamma rays are more like the nuclear waves that come from a nuclear explosion that can really damage tissue. But for the most part, what we deal with individually are the radio, infrared, and visible waves. On the radio spectrum, there are a beginning point and an end point. The beginning, the low frequency, is 530 kilohertz, or 530,000 hertz per second, 530,000 waves per second. That's on the low end of the radio spectrum. On the high end is the 108 million hertz per second, or 108 million or 108 megahertz, or or 100 million cycles per second, or waves per second. This radio spectrum is really kind of broken down into, on the lower end is AM radio, on the upper end is FM radio. So in the early days of this, of radio, like I said, anybody who could buy a transmitter, anybody who wanted to buy a transmitter, could have a transmitter that sent out a particular frequency. And that frequency could be anywhere from 530 kilohertz to 108 megahertz. The problem was that these frequencies could conceivably be one right next to the other. There may have been a radio station that is at the 100 megahertz position on the frequency, around the spectrum, and then some amateur could buy a transmitter that's at the 99.5 megahertz point on the spectrum. That means that the 100 megahertz and the 99.5 megahertz are interfering with each other. So if that radio station is trying to sell advertising, it's having problems doing that because nobody is getting the message, because the 99.5 transmitter is interfering with its signal. So Congress is wanting to do something about this. And so within the first important part of the Radio Act of 1927 is the requirement to assign frequencies through licenses. If you want to buy a transmitter, if you want to use a transmitter, you have to have a license. And once you get that license, then you are going to be assigned a frequency. The idea, again, is to spread the frequencies out along the spectrum so that they're not interfering with each other. If we look at frequencies here in Eau Claire, WUEC 89.7 is at the 89.7 megahertz frequency on the spectrum. On the other hand, WBIZ Z100 is at the 100.7 frequency on the radio spectrum. They're separated far enough such that they don't interfere with each other. Once you start, if you had BIZ at the 100, you're not going to find another radio station in Eau Claire that's really in the like the 95 megahertz, because that's going to start to interfere with the frequency that WBIZ is already on. What did this first part do? Just what it was supposed to do. It cut down on the number of broadcasters. You have to have a license, and then you have to be assigned a frequency. If you are not, then you are considered a pirate broadcaster, and officials can come to you and confiscate your equipment and then fine you for operating an unlicensed transmitter. So the idea here was we need fewer broadcasters, and we need to regulate those who are there. The second thing is it got rid of that overlapping and the interference that having so many broadcasters was creating. This, of course, then had the third effect of making radio much more appealing to advertising. Now radio stations could go out and pursue advertisers because they were assured that there wasn't going to be any sort of transmission interference with their signals, and the advertisers then knew that the audience that they were targeting was actually probably going to get the message that they were trying to get out to their audience. The second part of the Radio Act of 1927 is something that is kind of in flux a little bit nowadays. In the early days of radio, in order to establish government authority, in order to establish, to break up the interference that was going on, Congress declared, and because the radio spectrum was a finite space, there was only a certain amount of space in this spectrum. What Congress did was declare the radio spectrum a natural resource of the United States, and therefore, because it was a natural resource, it was publicly owned. It was a public space. So if you wanted to use part of the spectrum, you had to have permission of the representatives of the public. And then the third part of the 1927 Radio Act, again, if this space is owned by the public, then as a broadcaster, it is your responsibility to act in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. The government saw broadcasters only as caretakers, only as public servants of taking care of this public resource. What is controversial about this nowadays, this is still in effect as far as the responsibilities of broadcasters. However, this responsibility has been neglected really over the last 60, 70 years of broadcasting. Broadcasters have gotten their licenses. A lot of them have kept them for a long, long time, 50, 60 years, and they have come to believe that they actually own their frequency. There has been legislation that has been proposed in Congress by broadcasters to actually make into law the fact that those who own licenses or who have licenses and who are on specific frequencies and have been there for a long time, they want it declared that they now own that frequency and they have complete control over it. So far, this hasn't been accepted by the Congress, and hopefully it never will be, because it's still a public resource and it is still owned by the public, and broadcasters are making lots and lots and lots of money on a entity that is owned by the American public. The final part of the 27 Radio Act is the establishment of an agency that will now regulate broadcasting, and this is the Federal Radio Commission. The Federal Radio Commission, the FRC, is established to, they are the government agency that is going to award the licenses to applicants that deserve the licenses, that have met the proper criteria. They're also going to be the ones that enforce the rules, and if need be, revoke licenses from broadcasters who are violating the rules or don't come up to the standard of serving the public in its capacity and in its the public necessity. The second legislation, or the third legislation that comes along here, is the Communications Act of 1934, and again, it's an extension of what was started in 1912, and then reinforced in 1927. The 1934 Act is, again, adding on to these other two laws. First thing is that they changed the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission, to the Federal Communications Commission. and expanded their responsibilities to not just radio, but to all sorts of broadcast communications, television, telephone, within the frequency, within the spectrum. There's also emergency frequencies. There are also military frequencies. Um, Once we get into the mobile phone era, it's those radio waves that are flying through the air from the satellites above us. Those are under the control of, or under the legislative control of the Federal Communications Commission. And of course, all of this has to do with interstate communications. The second change is limiting the number of stations, both at this point, just the number of radio stations that can be owned by one person or one group. Previous to this, companies could have as many radio stations as they wanted, or one person could own as many radio stations as he or she wanted. But again, the effort to control a monopolistic business comes to the government, and the effort here is to make sure that since it is the spectrum is a public resource, to limit how much control one group or one person can have over the communication technology in the United States. So in 1934, the rule is that a person or group cannot own more than 7 AM and 7 FM stations at one time. So in total, a person or group can't own more than 14 radio stations. So that's a look at legislation. The next part will be to look at where we are as far as radio is concerned in our modern times.